Our speaker is Bedross Der Matossian, one of the most, I would think, accomplished young scholars who I know will have a brilliant future in the study of Armenian issues. We distributed, and I hope this reached you, a half sheet with information about his academic achievements, so that I will not have to present you with a litany of achievements. This will allow you to follow up on the references, to look up his publications. That will be much more productive. Let me be somewhat informal. Bedross Der Matossian grew up in the Armenian community in Jerusalem. He attended Hebrew University. He moved on to Columbia University in New York to earn his PhD there. He taught at MIT, and he is currently an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. I had 3 encounters with him. The first one was just mouth to mouth, was a Lebanese philosopher, Elizabeth Kassab, who made me aware of him. This already indicates the transdisciplinary and international connections that we talk about. The second encounter was through his scholarship. This is a book that Bedross Der Matossian wrote. It's entitled Shattered Dreams of Revolution, subtitled From Liberty to Violence in the Late Ottoman Empire. It's a fascinating book. I was profoundly impressed, and I understand that there are copies available on a desk outside this room if someone is interested after the lecture to follow up on Professor Der Matossian's information. Finally, I encountered Professor Der Matossian just a month ago in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he had organized a major conference on 100 years of historiography of the Armenian genocide, and I was amazed. I had never experienced an assistant professor bringing together such an international massive event. It just demonstrated his presence in the international community of Armenia and Armenian genocide scholars. Bedross, it's a great honor to have you, and we look much forward to your talk.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here to give the Ohanessian lecture on the eve of the Centennial. That's a great honor, I think. On the eve of the great Centennial, 100 years ago, the major intellectuals on this day, on this night actually, were rounded up and sent to their destiny, were killed. Before I start talking about the subject, I would like to thank the Ohanessian chair, Professor Silversberg, the Institute for Global Studies, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and the Human Rights Program for organizing this event. Today I'm going to talk about the historiography of the Armenian genocide on the eve of the Centennial. The title is From Continuity to Contingency. I deem it necessary to discuss what have we learned in the past 3 decades about the Armenian genocide within the Western scholarship. I'm going to introduce different school of thoughts, different interpretations of the Armenian genocide, and hopefully towards the end we can have a discussion about the historiography in general, or any questions that you have regarding the current situation of the historiography of the Armenian genocide, about politics, about anything that comes into your mind. So, over the past 3 decades, the historiography of the Armenian genocide, one of the classical cases of genocides in the 20th century, has developed considerably. New approaches provide more complex analysis of the genocide that venture beyond rudimentary and essentialist arguments and representations. Concomitantly, the denialist literature has also developed, presenting quote-unquote alternative ways of viewing the event in order to counter quote-unquote Armenian allegations. The latter group employs the medium of American academic presses and journals in order to provide more legitimacy to its controversial venture. The following talk concentrates on the development of the Armenian genocide historiography in Western scholarship, primarily in Europe and the United States during the past 3 decades. The talk will highlight several approaches to interpreting the genocide after positioning this development in the context of the global changes taking place at the time. Of course, it is a daunting task to interpret the development of the Armenian Genocide Historiography in its entirety. For the sake of time, I will discuss the interpretation of several influential scholars. The primary aim is to understand the forms of the argument they employ and the variety of causal arguments they offer in explaining the genocide. Towards the end of the talk, I will provide some suggestions for further research in nascent areas of the field. I have chosen 6 important arguments provided by these scholars. First, debates of religion and continuum. Second, debates of nationalism and continuum. Third, cumulative policy of radicalization. Fourth, demographic engineering and assimilation. Fifth, state imperialism and contingency. And finally, understanding the second phase of the genocide. I'm going to explain each school of thought or each interpretation. One would not be able to understand the development of the historiography without situating it in the larger global context. Immediately in the post-genocide period, the historiography of the Armenian genocide began to take shape. The phase was characterized by rudimentary approaches, mostly by Armenian scholars who were survivors of the genocide, written in their indigenous languages. The genre of their writing ranged from preliminary historical studies to memoirs of their experiences. In the name of academic objectivity, some historians have downplayed the importance of these sources in the reconstruction of the history of the Armenian genocide. Additionally, due to the fact that these materials were written by members of the victim group, others have argued that they cannot constitute valuable or reliable historical documents because of their lack of objectivity. I am against this approach, by the way. Following this line of reasoning, some Armenian historians have systematically avoided the use of Armenian sources so that their scholarship would not be labeled as biased by international historians or Turkish scholars. While one could argue that much of this literature represents a way of mourning the lost homeland, whatever was written during this period is unique. As far as I know, there is no popular counterpart mirroring the same period of the time in Turkish historiography. Although some of these pieces sound more folkloric, amateur, than methodologically sound and historical, this does not undo the fact that they provide invaluable information on the history of the Armenian genocide. It is only recently that these studies and memoirs began to gain momentum in Western scholarship due to the relentless efforts by Armenian organizations such as the Gomidas Institute in translating these works and providing them to the Western scholars. The development of the historiography of the Armenian genocide in the past 3 decades took place in the context of the larger regional and global developments. It has been influenced by wider debates in the public sphere within Turkey and the West. In order to understand the global context of these developments, it is beneficial to situate them in the proper periods. Historian Hans Lucas Kieser provides five phases of historiographical developments concerning the destruction of Ottoman Armenians. The first phase of the genocide, is the phase of the genocide, 1915 to 1923. The second, in the shadows of European history, 1923-1945. Third, from Genocide Convention in 1948 to the Armenian Revival in the 1960s. Fourth, international debates, Holocaust studies, and the shadow of Armenian terrorism, 1970s, 1980s. And finally, the transnational, post-national period in the history writing since the 1990s. Of course, one needs to approach Kieser's periodization critically, because he does not incorporate the developments happening within the Armenian public sphere in general and Armenian historiography in particular. For example, he does not discuss the major edited volume by Kersam Aharonian on the 50th anniversary of the genocide. What interests us here is the last phase, the transnational, post-national period in history writing since the 1990s. The last decade of the 20th century should be considered as one of the most important phases in the history of the second half of the 19th century. The collapse of the Soviet Union resulted in the demise of the bipolar system and the triumph of Western hegemony, especially American hegemony around the globe. the fall of the Eastern Bloc and the reunification of Eastern Germany with Western Germany, the establishment of the European Union with the Maastricht Treaty on November 1, 1993, all of these developments had direct and indirect impacts on the development of the Armenian Genocide Historiography. The opening negotiations on possible entry of the Turkish Republic into the European Union caused a crack in the wall of silence in Turkey pertaining to the Armenian Genocide. In addition to this, external pressure on Turkey by European governments and the Armenian lobby contributed to the pollination of the discourse on Armenian genocide. The Turkish government's active repression of the taboo of the genocide since the early days of the Republic has been finally crumbling. Fatma Müge Göçek, a Turkish sociologist, explains this history of denial in a fascinating manner in her latest book, Denial of Violence. It is in the last decade of the 20th century that we see new critical studies of Turkish historiography that deviates from the Republican official narrative emerging in the West. The historiography of the Armenian genocide got a boost in the Western academic sphere with the development of Holocaust study in general and comparative genocide studies in particular. What highlights the period is the emergence of global history as a discipline in tandem with post-nationalist approaches to history, both of which had profound impact on the development of the field of comparative genocide studies. Thus, it is in the 90s that we see a new trend emerging among Turkish liberal historians on the Armenian genocide. Most of these scholars happen to be outside Turkey, reaping the fruits of academic freedom in their quest of countering the Turkish official narrative on the Armenian genocide. Moreover, the mass violence inflicted upon the other marginalized Christian groups within the Ottoman Empire, mainly the Assyrians and the Greeks, began to be recognized in the academic scholarship. And the most important contribution to the field has been done by David Gunt in his Massacres, Resistant Protectors, Muslim-Christian Relations in Eastern Anatolia during World War I, which was published in the year 2006. One of the earliest academic exchanges about the Armenian genocide between an Armenian and a Turkish scholar took place in a 1997 Dutch documentary entitled A Wall of Silence, directed by Dorothy Forma of the Humanist Broadcasting Foundation, which dealt with the academic relationship between the Armenian sociologist Balkan Dadrian and the Turkish sociologist Taner Akçam. In 1998, academic exchange took place between Armenian and Turkish scholars on the factors that led to the Armenian genocide in one of the issues of the Armenian Forum edited by Ara Sarafyan and featured Ronald Grigor-Suini, Balkan Dadrian, Engin Akarlı, and Selim Derengi. The core issues within these exchanges were the issue of contingency in the Armenian genocide, and secondly, the motivations of the young Turks in perpetrating the genocide. The exchanges between scholars rose to a new level in the year 2000 when two important international interdisciplinary groups featuring Armenian, Turkish, and European scholars met to examine the Armenian genocide and the last phase of the Ottoman Empire. Known as the Workshop of Armenian Turkish Scholarship, it was organized by Ronald Suini and his colleagues Fatma Müge Göçek and Girard Libaridian from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. It was convened in 2000 at the University of Michigan, then at the University of Chicago. What's initiated total of 8 meetings since its inception, the last of which took place in the year of 2011 at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Another major development that took place within the field of the Armenian Genocide Historiography was the conference entitled Ottoman Armenians During the Era of Imperial Decline, Academic Responsibility and Issues of Democracy, that was held in Istanbul in the year 2005. The conference, which was under huge pressure and was delayed and then it was convened, is considered an important step for Turkish liberal historiography because for the first time since the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, a meeting within a Turkish university questioned the state narrative on one of the most sensitive issues, the Armenian genocide, whether or not it was given the name. Of course, one should not forget that these developments took place at a time in which the Turkish state has intensified its denialist campaigns. Now I'll start discussing the different interpretations within the historiography. I'll start with the debate on religion and continuum. Vahakan Dadrian, the prominent genocide scholar and sociologist, has been one of the pioneers who began writing about the Armenian genocide in the Western academic sphere. His writings and scholarship had profound impact on shaping the interpretations of the Armenian genocide among Western scholars. His argument that genocide stemmed primarily from religion appears in two major works where he analyzes the Ottoman theocratic system. He then argues that secondaries stemmed from nationality. In his first major study, Dadarian argued that a culture of massacre developed in the Ottoman Empire, rationalizing the necessity of state violence as, and I quote, a weapon to deal with the outbreaks of international nationality conflicts, end quote. In his second major work, Dadarian argues that the Armenian genocide was the culmination of a deep-seated Turco-Armenian conflict that existed in the empire for centuries. According to him, this was mainly the result of the incompatibility of the theocratic Ottoman state with the rule over a heterogeneous population having diverse religions and cultures. Dadarian himself is a staunch supporter of the continuum approach. He views the earlier acts of massacres, the Hamidian massacres of 1894-1896, the Adana massacres of 1909, as, and I quote, a prelude to, if not a rehearsal for the World War I genocide, end quote. According to him, World War I provided the opportunity structure that is the necessary conditions for genocide. Dadarian does make an important observation, and that is the fact of impunity within these three massacres. He argues that past impunity emboldened the young Turks to commit acts of violence towards the vulnerable Armenian population. The second interpretation is the interpretation of nationalism and continuum. Nationalism has been regarded by some scholars as another causal argument in explaining the genocide. According to this argument, the Armenian genocide was the byproduct of the young Turks' nationalist ideology. This argument was first made by Professor Richard Hovhannisyan in his edited volume, The Armenian Genocide in Perspective. Most of the articles in this volume were limited to explaining the Armenian genocide as the result of Turkish nationalist ideology and political ambitions of the CUP leaders. For example, another in Hovhannisyan's edited volume, Stepan Asturian argues that this ideology, formulated in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, reflected both elite and popular attitudes towards Armenians, which led directly to the genocide. He contends that there simply was no place for Armenians in this new nationalist vision of the Ottoman Empire. Over the years, Hovhannisyan edited multiple interdisciplinary volumes on the Armenian genocide. His articles and edited volumes should be regarded as significant contributions to the field of the Armenian genocide studies. Due to the limited time I have today, I'm only going to concentrate on his last edited volume on the Armenian genocide. In his first article of this book, Hovhannisyan discusses the latest views about the Armenian genocide. He says that, and I quote, the combination of a xenophobic nationalist mindset and a total war ethic produced a lethal atmosphere from which the Armenians could not escape, end quote. Here Hovhannisyan presents the arguments for and against continuum of genocidal intent and contends that, and I quote, these are not mutually exclusive. He believes that the genocide of 1915 was quantitatively and qualitatively different from the Hamidian massacres of 1890s. According to him, the Hamidian massacres were a futile effort to preserve the status quo. In contrast, the extreme wing of the CUP did not want to maintain the status quo, but rather to alter it drastically, and I quote, by creating a new society based on a single ethno-religious, linguistic, and cultural identity, end quote. In doing so, they rejected the old system of plural society and the confessional-based millet system. In this new order, there was no place for Armenians and other non-Muslim and non-Turkish elements. They all had to be either assimilated or eliminated to fit the new order. Despite the difference, Hovhannisyan argues that the entire period from the 1890s to 1920s constituted a continuum of ethnic cleansing, forced religious conversion, de-Armenization of the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. He concludes by arguing that the Armenian genocide was indeed premeditated, but not necessarily inevitable. Developments in World War I provided the cover under which to intensify and accelerate the cleansing process and to run the possibility of a final solution into an accomplished fact. The third approach is demographic engineering, assimilation, and the Armenian genocide. In his most recent work on the Armenian genocide, The Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity, the Armenian Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing in the Ottoman Empire, Turkish sociologist historian Taner Akçam provides new evidence from the Ottoman archives in order to demonstrate that the Armenian genocide and the expulsion of the Greeks from the Ottoman Empire was a deliberate policy of the CUP to get rid of the Armenian Christians. In the case of the Greeks, this was done through ethnic cleansing, and in the case of the Armenians, it was carried out through systematic annihilation. In order to prove this, Akçam relies on 600 documents from the ministerial Ottoman archives. By uncovering the central role played by demographic engineering and assimilation in the Armenian genocide, Akçam attempts to change how the Armenian genocide is understood and show that physical destruction was not the only aspect of genocidal process. Akçam gives a central place to a single source, the Ottoman archives, as the basis of reconstructing a sequence of events as viewed and recorded by the central authorities. Akçam starts his work by concentrating on the ethnic cleansing of the Greeks, which took place throughout the years 1913-1914 by the Ottoman government until its entry to World War I. Akçam sees a clear continuity of ethnic cleansing between the Greeks and the Armenians by arguing that the policies that were set in motion against the Greeks between the years 1913-1914 appear to foreshadow the subsequent wartime deportations of the Armenians. The difference between them was that while the Greeks were deported and expelled with brutality, the Armenians were targeted for an outright annihilation. In the decision to exterminate the Armenians, the CUP's overarching objective was the homogenization of the population of Anatolia. Akçam strongly believes in the concept of process. He argues that the annihilation of the Armenians did not result from a single decision on a given date. Rather, the genocide appears to have been, and I quote, the cumulative outcome of a series of increasingly radical decisions, each triggering the next in the cascading sequence of events. He believes that the final decision to eliminate the Armenian population were made during the discussions held in Istanbul in the end of March 1915, which was done by using the dual-track mechanism. What shaped the Armenian deportations, according to Akçam, were the demographic anxieties. The population ratios where Armenians were deported and where they remained were decisive in the deportations, and the deportations were carried out accordingly. In the case of the Armenians, demographic engineering took the form of genocide. Akçam's thesis is that the Armenian genocide was not implemented as a demographic engineering, took the form. Akçam's thesis, is that the Armenian genocide was not implemented only as a demographic engineering, but also as destruction and annihilation. Akçam contends that the religious conversion and assimilation of Armenian children into Muslim households were two of the most significant structural components of the Armenian genocide. He says that assimilation was as much a structural element of genocide as physical destruction. The fourth approach is that of argument of cumulative policy of radicalization and genocide. Donald Bloxham's interpretation of the Armenian genocide is based on the cumulative radicalization of CUP's policy towards the Armenians. In his major work on the subject, Bloxham argues that the Armenian genocide was an archetypal example of a nationalist genocide. It represents a clear logic of ethnic nationalism when carried to its absolute extreme in multinational societies. According to him, the CUP led a drive towards a hegemonic European state model of ethnic national homogeneity. An essential part of this drive was the expropriation of Christian property in order to transfer the capital to Muslims for the creation of a Turkish Muslim bourgeoisie as an engine of Turkish nationalism and economic independence. Bloxham does not believe in the existence of a blueprint before World War I to exterminate the Armenians. He argues that despite the great deterioration of CUP-Armenian relations, especially after the Balkan Wars and the Armenian Reform Project of 1914, there is little evidence that a policy to physically destroy the community was forged prior to the First World War. Bloxham's major argument about the genocide is that it emerged from a series of more limited measures implemented regionally and transformed into an empire-wide plan through a process of cumulative policy radicalization. He maintains that pinpointing the precise time within that period is extremely difficult and unlikely ever to be achieved definitively. According to him, it is only by the summer of 1915 that it is possible to speak about a crystallized policy of general killing and death by attrition. After the Sarıkamış defeat, the Armenian Van uprising/defense, and the Anglo-French assault on the Dardanelles, Turkish policy towards the Armenians became more radicalized, turning from selective region deportation in the previous period to general deportations of all the Armenians. In Bloxham's view, the relationship between intention and contingency remained intimate in the course of the genocide. The Armenian genocide provided the emblematic and central violence of Ottoman Turkey's transition into a modernizing nation state. The genocide and accompanying expropriations were intrinsic to the development of the Turkish Republic in the form in which it appeared in 1924. The fifth interpretation is entitled State Imperialism, Contingency, and the Armenian Genocide. Ronald Grigor Sweeney's own views about the Armenian genocide builds on the argument from ideology, which he considers to have been an important factor in the Ottoman plans for the Armenians. For Sweeney, the Young Turk ideology was an unstable mix of Turkish nationalism, pan-Turanism, pan-Islam, and several forms of Ottomanism. He argues that genocide did not take place in order for the Young Turks to create a Turkey for the Turks or homeland for the Turkish nation. Rather, he contends that the genocide was carried out, and I quote, as a perverse and extreme security measure based in an ethno-religious framing that depicted Armenians as a deadly threat to the empire, end quote. Sweeney firmly believes that even on the eve of the genocide, the imperial mission of the CUP still involved ruling a multinational empire. In his latest book, he emphasizes the fact that the Young Turks who carried out the genocide were never purely Turkish ethno-nationalists, never religious fanatics, but remained Ottoman modernizers in their fundamental self-conception. They were primarily state imperialist, empire preservers, rather than the founders of an ethnic nation state. According to him, the murder of hundreds of thousands of Armenians was primarily an effort to save an empire that was in disarray and under threat. Sweeney argues that there were three main factors that led to the genocide. A shift in the nature of the Ottoman Empire itself from a traditional multi-religious state to modernizing, centralizing state that increasingly adopted Turkish nationalist, pan-Turkic, and pan-Islamic ambitions. Second, he argues a shift in the attitudes of leading and ordinary Turks toward Armenians and Armenians towards Turks. And third, the World War, with the real danger from the Russians and the British and the imagined danger from the Armenians, presented the most radical Young Turks with the new opportunities to deal with the Armenian problem. In the First World War, the empire suffered a series of defeats in the east that convinced the leaders of an imminent Armenian danger. Like the other scholars, Sweeney contends that sometimes in February or March, the CUP decided to carry out a vicious policy of deportation combined with selective killing to clear the region of Armenians. The policy initiated by the state in brutalizing context of the war and rapidly degenerated into a massive campaign of murder. Sweeney does not view the genocide as a natural, inevitable extension of Turkish racial or religious hatred for the Armenians. He concludes, and I quote, "Rather than a long-planned and carefully orchestrated program of extermination, the Armenian genocide was more a vengeful and determined act of suppression that turned into an opportunistic policy to rid Anatolia of Armenians once and for all, eliminating the wedge that they provided for foreign intervention in the region and opened the way for the fantastic dream of the Turanian Empire." The final approach is that of Raymond Kevorkian. Last but not least is the major contribution by the French-Armenian historian Raymond Kevorkian to the history of the Armenian genocide. Unlike other historians, Kevorkian firmly believes that it is essential to exploit the Armenian sources, comparing them with materials provided by European diplomats and missionaries and also with each other. Kevorkian for decades researched the Aram-Andonian collection preserved in the AJB Unubarian Library in Paris. The collection consists of 62 cases mounting to above 5,000 documents about Armenian genocide that Andonian himself collected during the genocide years. These documents, which are collected by Andonian himself between the years 1918 and 1920, describe the events and the status of the Armenian refugees. In his work, Kevorkian published major studies based on the 15 files. We have 62 files. He concentrated on 15 files pertaining to the Armenian refugees in Syria and Mesopotamia, which he labeled as the second phase of the genocide, called La Deuxième phase de génocide, spanning from February to December 1915. So that's the second phase that Kevorkian brings to us. In this work, Kevorkian laid out, and I quote, the documentary foundations of the period of the genocide hitherto virtually unknown to historians, trying, among other things, to reconstruct the network of the concentration camp set up locally by the Sub-Directorate of the Deportees in Aleppo. By examining region by region process of deportation and annihilation in his latest book, Kevorkian demonstrates that the Young Turks liquidation plan targeted only the populations of the 6 eastern provinces, vilayets considered to be Armenians' historical homelands. Kevorkian contends that the convoys that were sent out from the eastern vilayets were systematically destroyed on the way, and that only small minority of deportees arrived in their final destination. In contrast, those who were deported from the colonies in Anatolia or Thrace were sent to Syria with their families, often by rail, reaching at least as far as Cilicia. The second phase of the genocide targeted these survivors, most of whom came from Anatolia or Cilicia. Kevorkian argues that this phase of violence, including the concentration camps in Syria and Upper Mesopotamia, some of them today are under the control of ISIS, was a long terra incognita for scholars. According to him, the decision to destroy these remaining deportees was taken in late February or early March 1916 and affected 500,000 surviving deportees who had reached Syria and Mesopotamia 6 months and more earlier. Kevorkian argues that the second phase of the genocide, and I quote, illustrates the Young Turk Central Committee's genocidal will even be better than the first, for the Central Committee could not in this case take shelter behind this discourse about security and its theory about a plot, Armenian plot against the Turkish state. This phase aimed at destroying a population of which great majority was made up of women and children. Concluding and some suggestions. The above examples demonstrate the development of the Armenian Genocide Historiography from monolithic interpretation to multi-causal interpretation of the Armenian Genocide by using new methodologies and unearthing new sources. Concentrating on few approaches, I strive to demonstrate the level of sophistication that the historiography of the Armenian Genocide has reached. Despite the fact that all the scholars I've discussed above agree that the crime that was perpetrated against the Armenians was a genocide, they disagree on important issues pertaining to premeditation, contingency, continuum, and motives. While it is difficult for a scholar to utilize one approach over another, I believe that one can appropriate different aspects from these approaches in constructing new approaches to the genocide. At the end of the day, history is about interpreting the past, and interpretation is based on the critical evaluation of available documents using sound methodological approaches. Of course, a historian's inclinations also affect the result. Until we have full access to all the archives pertaining to the period, most importantly, the military archives in Ankara called the Atase, we will not be able to reach conclusive results about major issues that have been debated by historians. Despite the positive developments within the historiography in the past 2 decades, there are many areas within the field of the Armenian genocide studies that remain in their infancy. These areas are microhistorical approaches to the Armenian genocide, the Armenian genocide in the context of the other Christian genocides in the empire, an in-depth examination of the second phase of genocide that was pioneered by Raymond Kevorkian himself, economic dimension of the Armenian genocide, what were the economic repercussions, dimensions, the whole idea of confiscation of the abandoned properties, comparative perspectives on the Armenian genocide with the other genocide of the 20th century, women and children during the Armenian genocide, humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention during the Armenian genocide, cultural genocide. We don't have much written about the cultural genocide. And then finally, oral history and the Armenian genocide. For the sake of time, I'd like to concentrate briefly on the microhistorical approaches to the Armenian genocide. I deem it extremely necessary to understand the Armenian genocide from the perspective of the peripheral regions. It is well known that the genocide was not a monolithic process. It was dependent to a large extent on the local exigencies, and most importantly, on the cooperation and resistance of local actors, elites, tribal leaders, notables, gendarmes, etc. The dynamics of power within each region were different, and these dictated the course of the massacres. To date, the most important microhistorical study of the genocide remains that of Uğur Ümit Ungur, which is a detailed case study and conceptual analysis of the genocide in the province of Diyarbakir by using the latest theories on mass violence. The name of his book is The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation States and Eastern Anatolia, 1913-1915. And by this, I finish my talk. Thank you very much.